Good, thank you. Just checking in. I'm here.
Thanks for being here today. We are going to get started in 30 seconds. All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started with our briefing today. We had another person join us. So good afternoon. My name is Andrea Lovanhill, and I am interim CEO at Committee for Children. We're a nonprofit organization that has been advancing child well-being through social emotional learning for more than 40 years, and we currently reach more than 16.5 million young people across this country annually. Committee for Children, along with our collaborator, CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, are so proud to host this briefing on centering social emotional learning in responses to schools reopening. And thank you all for being here to discuss such an urgent topic, making sure our kids are equipped with the tools they need to restart school safely and successfully with support for not only academic well-being, but social and emotional well-being as well. Now, the coronavirus pandemic and continued racial injustices have further exposed and likely worsened a significant equity chasm in our educational system. One way that we can help address that gap is to ensure greater focus on building social and emotional learning, or SEL, skills and knowledge, and that's needed for all students and all educators. So when school communities come together, we know some will have more complex mental health needs. Some will have experienced trauma, increased trauma, brought on both by the pandemic and continuing racial adversity. So regardless of whether schools reopen late, reopen remotely, shift to models running year-round, they have to do that safely and with ample support for students. Because SEL undergirds trauma-informed practice and mental wellness, and because SEL is truly an integral part of the learning equation, we must now, really especially now, locate SEL in the center of our educational efforts. SEL is fundamental for all students. It's beneficial for all educators too, and we know teaching is an incredibly stressful job. That stress is heightened unimaginably by our current circumstances. So during today's briefing, our speakers who have come from the state and district level are going to share how SEL has been and should be centered in this space, and what supports from the federal level will help K-12 educators further center SEL in the education continuum. Our speakers today will bring weight to questions of how we serve all our youth and educators, but especially those youth of color and those furthest from opportunity, with respect to SEL development, in response to trauma, and in support of overall mental wellness. First, however, I want to give our congressional champions a chance to talk about how policy leadership can support and enable educators on the ground to make the best decisions possible for students and families. First, we welcome House Labor, Health, and Education Appropriations Subcommittee Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro. As the chair of the Subcommittee on Appropriations for Labor, Health, Human Services, and Education, Congresswoman DeLauro has been determined to increase support for education and make college more affordable for American students and their families. Most recently, she helped champion $172 million for a social emotional learning initiative to support SEL and whole child approaches to education in the fiscal year 2021 appropriations bill. Welcome, Congresswoman. Oh, you'll need to unmute.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your kind words. I see my colleague Bobby Scott, who chairs the Education and Labor Committee, and we really are partners in these in these efforts. And I want to say a thank you to the Committee for Children and for the speakers today, in addition to my colleague Congressman Scott, who is unbelievable champion. It's his life's work. But on the panel, I guess it's Melissa Schlinger, Vice President of Practice and Programs at CASEL, Dr. Rose Prejean Harris, the Director of SEL for Atlanta Public Schools in Georgia, Paolo Di Maria, the Superintendent of Public Instruction for the state of Ohio, and Carmen Ziomata Urbina, the Deputy Director of Oregon's Department of Education. I'm delighted to be able to add my voice to the chorus of experts, to state leaders, and to be joining historic and very impactful organizations, the Committee for Children, the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning. For more than 40 years, the committee has championed a global fight for the safety of children, for social emotional learning, to help our kids to learn, to grow, to thrive. And there isn't a better mission that's there. And so that is shared by CASEL. In fact, SEL was defined by CASEL more than 2 decades ago. And now you support state, you support districts, you support nationwide to make SEL a priority. The framework which you identified, the 5 core pieces: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision-making. What the organizations do is to fight to put children and these competencies at center stage. New report from response to reopening, state efforts to elevate social and emotional learning during the pandemic. It identified, quote, 6 recommendations for states to continue their support of SEL. Communicate SEL is important for all students and adults. Define and coordinate SEL and mental health supports as both universal and preventive measures. They need disseminate the SEL practices so schools have ready access. Provide the professional learning and support for adult SEL competencies, capacities, and wellness. And 5, leverage data for continuous improvement. And 6, encourage the use of funds. So I would add a 7th to that. And is one that I have been focused on ensuring that the federal government provides schools the adequate and robust funding, especially for SEL, so that we have safe and trauma-prepared schools. More important than ever, as you pointed out, and long-held priorities. I speak for myself there. I had the opportunity to co-found in 2009 a bipartisan baby caucus, where we put front and center the public policies that affect young kids. And as you pointed out, I'm blessed to be able to chair the subcommittee on health, education, and labor. I also want to add that when I was first became chair of the subcommittee, what I did in my own district is I pulled together all of the education groups to listen to them about what are the things that they thought we ought to focus our attention on. And I'm proud to say, one, they talked about community schools, and you will see in the labor age bill in 2020 and now in 21, we have put in funding for community schools. But above all, they said you've got to try to focus in on social and emotional learning. And they talked about preschool kids in this regard very, very, very quickly. So we did propose in 2020 before the pandemic, and we enacted the first dedicated federal investment in social emotional learning. It made it across the finish line thanks to the advocacy of the Committee for Children and for CASEL, and we have been working together to get more funding for SEL. Last week, we advanced our funding bill for 2021, and in it we provide $50 million more for SEL initiative to $172 million total. And this is about the whole child approach to education. And quite honestly, I didn't have to come to the Congress to learn about the whole child. This is so near and dear to my heart because it was inspired by Dr. James Comer. Jim Comer, psychiatrist at Yale Child Study Center. He worked with the New Haven Public Schools starting in 1968, and his model for child learning focuses on taking care of kids' social needs. He is part of the continued advisory committee I have in these areas, and it was about their social and emotional learning, their development, and that the interventions have a positive impact on students. He was one of the first researchers to demonstrate that it's possible to improve school environments, close the achievement gap. 50 years ago in 1968, he and a dream team from Yale worked with 2 severely struggling schools in New Haven, Connecticut. In 2 years, the schools were rivaling the highest performing districts in attendance and school climate. Unrivaled success, and this collaborative and comprehensive approach to student success would be implemented in more than 1,000 schools in 26 states and in 7 countries. So this is the type of program, type of investment, as you understand and I understand, Bobby Scott understands, it's crucial to helping our kids through this period of time with twin health and economic crisis that exacerbate hardship, poverty, hunger, and trauma. So I'm very encouraged by the robust growing evidence base behind the SEL strategies, trauma-informed services, the whole child approaches to learning, which is why funding these interventions is one of my top priorities. We have the recently released National Commission on Social, Emotional, Academic Development report, chronicles decades of research showing that these dimensions of learning deeply linked, and that educating the whole student involves integrating and sustaining the dimensions throughout the day. So also CASEL, in that study, students who received these interventions showed lasting, I repeat that, positive impacts on variables such as high school graduation rates, college attendance, and lower likelihoods of being arrested or being diagnosed with a clinical mental health disorder. RAND finds that there are at least 60 SEL interventions that have been evaluated that meet the evidence requirements for ESSA, which Bobby knows all about and will speak about. We all want to have our schools open. We need a safe space for our kids. And Randy Weingarten, who spoke to our committee not that long ago, she talked about trauma-informed practices and the resources to make up for the lost learning time, especially for youngsters who are the most vulnerable to slipping through the cracks. And we want teachers, we want students to be face-to-face as much as possible. In some states around the nation, with the virus out of control, we cannot simply open schools based on the statements of the Secretary of Education. Be frank with you, no leadership from the executive branch. Secretary DeVos has no national plan. She refuses to answer the question of whether schools should follow CDC guidelines. The CDC has said reopening schools in person for 5 days is the highest risk scenario. We need to provide the resources to support the evidence-based recommendations of our medical experts and our educators. So I know that Bobby will. We're going to push the House and then the Senate and the White House to invest in our kids, to invest in SEL. Frankly, airlines received a bailout, $58 billion. Real estate developers got help, which they needed. And the least we can do for our children is to invest in their social and in emotional learning. One of the best investments that we can make is making that investment in our kids, especially at a time when they and their families are experiencing trauma at such an uncertain and unstable time. Thank you all for doing what you do, for making it possible, providing us with the information that we need to do our job. Bobby will attest that Congress is an institution that responds to external pressure. You are the external pressure. Keep making noise and don't take no for an answer. And thanks so much for welcoming me to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for those important words and for your support. Next, we have with us House Education and Labor Committee Chairman Bobby Scott. Congressman Scott is co-sponsor of the HEROES Act, the latest supplemental relief bill passed by the House that supports funding a continuum of SEL and K-12 education. Mr. Scott has long been a champion of public education through bills such as the Strength and Diversity Act. He has pushed for increased family and community engagement, along with improvement to educator diversity that reflects culturally responsive strategies which align with social emotional learning goals. Welcome, Congressman.
Thank you, Andrea, for your very kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you for having Rosa speak. She is one of the strongest advocates for children and quality education in the House of Representatives. So it's a pleasure to be on the program with her. I want to thank both CASEL and the Committee for Children for working to promote social emotional learning practices across the country. And I want to thank all of the educators and administrators who are supporting our students through these difficult times. The need for evidence-based social emotional learning has never been greater. Nearly 50 million children have had their education disrupted, and underserved children across the country are disproportionately suffering from the effects of this pandemic. But as you know, SEL has long played a critical role in education beyond responding to widespread emergencies. Even before the pandemic, roughly 34 million children, about 45% of our nation's children, had endured an adverse childhood experience, an ACE, that threatened their ability to grow and learn. Yet more than 70% of children who needed mental health support were not receiving appropriate care. Of those students, low-income students and students of color disproportionately suffer from this lack of social and emotional support. And while underserved students are more likely to need these supports, they're also more likely to attend segregated high-poverty schools that do not have the resources to provide the mental health services. Last September, the Subcommittee on Early Childhood, Elementary and Secondary Education held a hearing to discuss the lack of emotional health support for students and the need for data-driven school practices. The hearing reaffirmed that all students stand to benefit from SEL and trauma-informed instruction, and that these practices shouldn't be considered a fringe approach to education, but a core part of it. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic and the racial justice crisis have amplified the need for SEL support services and trauma-informed care. I know many teachers across the country have been working hard to implement SEL practices and lesson plans to ensure the best supports for student learning. As schools make tough decisions about reopening classrooms, it's important that we prioritize the social emotional well-being of our nation's students. We all want to get students back to the classroom to access the benefits of full-time in-person instruction. We know that kind of instruction, full-time in-person, is best to achieve academic success. It's best for learning social skills. It's best to maintain proper nutrition because they get nice school meals. We can identify child abuse if they're showing up at school every day. And let's be serious, you're not going to open up the economy without opening up the schools, but it has to be done safely. And this administration's failed response to the pandemic has had significant effect on hindering our efforts to safely opening our schools. Without a science-based response plan, new surges in COVID-19 infections are continuing across the country. That's only deepened the health risk of opening our schools for students and staff. In fact, the daily number of new cases in the United States is now higher than when schools first closed in March. At the same time, the administration has done nothing to provide state and local governments with the funding to offset the looming budget cuts for education or help schools address the health risk for students and staff. Most schools districts currently do not only lack funding to afford sanitation equipment and services to safely open classrooms, they also cannot afford to invest in delivering the SEL and trauma-informed instruction that would help students avoid long-lasting social and emotional harm. Unfortunately, the Department of Education still has provided no plan for providing students with safe in-person education. The only thing they've offered is, if you don't open, we're going to cut your funding. That is not a plan. Instead, it has blamed students and teachers for not doing enough to reopen the schools and threatening the various resources that they need to support the students. And that's why the House passed the HEROES Act, a COVID-19 relief package that reflects commitment not only to opening the schools can open safely, but taking action to safely bring students back into the classroom. It provides $1 trillion to help state and local governments maintain their budgets. If we do not maintain the state and local government funding, they have to balance their budgets. First thing to be cut will be state and will be education. We saw this in Virginia. We've seen it across the country. Hundreds of thousands of education officials, employees have already been laid off, and it's going to get worse before it gets better unless we provide support for state and local government. Once we've done that, we provide an additional $100 billion for education, most of it for K through 12, to continue delivering instruction and critical student services, including mental health services. It includes an allocation of $100 million for Project Advancing Wellness and Resilience Education Grants, or Project Aware grants, which help states strengthen mental health support services for young people. Unfortunately, the Senate has refused to take action on the HEROES Act so far, and it passed over 2 months ago, and we need to take action soon because people need to plan. One of the things that the CDC has pointed out is you need proper ventilation. That's why you can have restaurants serving food outside but not inside, because as people are breathing, the virus starts building up. You need proper ventilation. GAO recently had a study that showed that almost half the school districts need to seriously replace or repair almost half of their ventilation systems. You can't send somebody to check the week before school opens and expect them to be able to repair the ventilation systems. Are they going to have school nurses? Try to hire a bunch of school nurses on a one or 2 week notice. And if you can't find qualified nurses, you could probably hire people who are good at the STEM areas, and have them trained an 8-week course on how to detect problems with the virus, at least to detect and refer to other professionals. You can do that with several weeks. You can't provide that training the week before school opens. You need the money that's in the CARES Act, in the HEROES Act, and in the Moving Forward Act for school construction to make that possible, but you need planning and you need the resources, and the Senate has not taken action. To encourage the Senate to advance the critical legislation and to deliver the urgent support for our schools, we need people on this call to continue to make sure your voices are heard. Call your United States senators. Now more than ever, Congress needs to hear the urgency of our educators and students' needs, and we must meaningfully support students' physical and emotional health as whole people, both during this pandemic and beyond. So Andrea, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. I'm more than happy to be with my distinguished friend, the gentlelady from Connecticut, Rosa DeLauro, a strong advocate for children. We work together on so much, and pleased to be on the program with her. And I certainly look forward to working with you and your organization in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Congressman. And really, we have such gratitude for these congressional leaders for being champions of social emotional well-being for educators, for students, and for families. And I'd now like to introduce our moderator for today, Melissa Schlinger, Vice President of Practice and Programs for CASEL, where she heads the Collaborating Districts Initiative. Melissa?
Thanks, Andrea. And thank you so much, Congresswoman DeLauro and Congressman Scott. For 25 years, CASEL's been advancing SEL research and supporting educators and policy leaders to understand and implement SEL in ways that enhance the experience and outcomes of all students, preschool to high school. CASEL is known as the trusted source for knowledge about high-quality, evidence-based social and emotional learning. As has been mentioned, our nation is currently experiencing multiple intertwined and extraordinary events that have impacted all of us in significant ways, and they have not impacted all of us equally. Now more than ever is a critical time to examine the important role that schools can play in supporting all of our students' social, emotional, and academic learning, as well as positive mental health and overall well-being. By incorporating a systemic approach to SEL that is asset-based, culturally sensitive, and trauma-informed, schools can create a foundation for supporting whole child development. But what does that even mean, to be asset-based, culturally sensitive, or trauma-informed? And how do we know who needs what supports and how much? When we talk about trauma-informed, we're referring to the specific practices that can take into account the impact that this and other traumas can have on brain development, emotions, behavior, learning, and trust. In order to create emotionally safe environments and opportunities for healing, an asset-based and culturally sensitive approach will ensure that trauma doesn't define our students, but that the healing process is centered on positive relationships and environments that will uplift their strengths, affirm cultural assets and identity, and provide a sense of belonging. We see SEL as a core component of helping students and adults process trauma and promote positive mental health and achieve equitable outcomes. In terms of understanding who needs what supports, we know that all students should have access to high-quality, evidence-based SEL programs, practice, and learning environments. Educators may also use evidence-based assessments to identify students who may need additional interventions. But it's important to note that social and emotional competency assessments are not intended to be used as screeners for identifying trauma or mental health services, but they can help highlight the strengths that all students bring and that we can build upon to help them cope with the stresses and process their emotions. Through our Collaborating Districts initiative, CASEL has partnered closely with 20 large districts, and through our Collaborating States initiative, we've worked with 38 states and counting. These initiatives are focused on promoting effective, systemic, equity-focused SEL, in which we learn with and from our education leaders about the policy and practice mechanisms that will create systemic change for all youth. I'm happy to introduce 3 education leaders who can share more about their experiences and challenges in this new era of education. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Rosa Prejean-Harris, who's the Director of SEL in Atlanta Public Schools. We'll be hearing from Ohio State Superintendent Paolo DeMaria and Oregon Deputy Director of Education Carmen Xiomara Urbina. Let's start with Dr. Rosa Prejean-Harris. Rose?
Good afternoon. Atlanta Public Schools and the majority of Metro Atlanta school districts have decided to open schools virtually with a plan to assess moving to a hybrid or face-to-face model as the public health data dictates. With this in mind, our school district has the social and emotional well-being of students and staff at the center of its reopening plan. Our superintendent, Dr. Lisa Herring, with the support of our Board of Education, has allowed for an adjusted school calendar with a 2-week roadmap to learning that is designed to prepare teachers and leaders to put practices into place that will focus on family connections, team building, safety planning, and professional development. The SEL team in APS is currently conducting training opportunities centered on adult self-care and wellness, creating community and building relationships in a virtual learning space, and redesigned mini lessons that focus on SEL skills such as self-management strategies, identifying emotions and emotional triggers, student voice, and healing circles. Parents will also have access to these SEL trainings in collaboration with our parent liaisons at every school. As a district, like many other districts around the nation, we recognize that the onset of the pandemic has exposed some major inequities in access to basic necessities such as food, housing, jobs, and job security, technology, internet access, transportation, and medical services. Not only are our students and families in high poverty areas suffering from the lack of economic resources, but also our staff, especially our hourly rate employees. For us, this means that we have not only to find ways to support our families, but also to take care of the needs of our staff members. Our district departments, from human resources to food and nutrition, to student services and teaching and learning, are collaborating to ensure that all of the needs of our students and staff are met. It is a challenge, but we have pooled our resources along with our community partners' supports to cover gaps in food shortages, computer and internet accessibility, and economic relief, as well as mental health and safety checks. In light of all that has and is happening, we understand even more now how our district functions as a family. We recognize that more than ever, we need each other and that our strength is tied to the way that we support one another. When I think about support, I think about Miss Olga Morton, one of our bus drivers, who showed up every day to deliver meals to our students. When asked why, she stated, "I've been in this type of situation before, such as homelessness, when I needed this help. I came to help faithfully in this high-risk situation because kids needed the food and I wanted to be there, the same as when someone was there for me. I'm glad to have helped the students of APS not be hungry." Or in the words of Miss Sasha Mills, a fourth grade teacher at Burgess Peters Elementary, who said this about why SEL matters while teaching virtually during the onset of the pandemic. "Building authentic relationships with students and families have proven to be critical now more than ever. Having a thorough understanding of each child's unique interests, personalities, skills, learning styles, and using this knowledge in shaping student experiences has been key. Keeping students motivated and engaged while simultaneously creating sacred time for checking in with students and families is the rhythm for successful teaching. Creativity, energy, flexibility, and consistent communication led with a heart of compassion makes for a successful virtual learning partnership." Ms. Martin and Ms. Mills do not stand alone in their desire to help our students and families make the best of this situation. But most importantly, as a district with a core belief that the social and emotional well-being of our students and staff are paramount for success, we will continue a focus on growing SEL skills for both the adults and students in our district. We will continue to help individuals discover their strengths, increase their ability to self-advocate, to self-manage, and to make responsible decisions. We are committed to doing this work because it allows us the opportunities to see each other as human beings, to empathize with one another, and to communicate in a way that creates safe spaces for everyone. When we teach and sharpen SEL skills, we grow as individuals and as a collective. And in light of the tensions created by the racial injustice and the senseless murders of Black males throughout this country, it is imperative that we continue to address ways to help us to better understand each other so that we can grow in cultural competence and learn to be better humans. As you can see, SEL funding is imperative because we do not want school districts to have to decide whether or not they can afford to offer these services to our students and or our staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prejean Harris. Next, we'll hear from Ohio State Superintendent Paolo DeMaria.
Thanks so much, Melissa. It's great to be with everybody today. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedules to be part of this event. I also want to remind many of you heard CEO of Cleveland Metropolitan School District, Eric Gordon, talk about how his district was addressing the various needs of their students, in particular social emotional learning. And one of the things I pride myself significantly in Ohio is that we at the State Department try to create the conditions where Eric and people like him across the state can succeed with their schools and districts. So, as I reflect on what happened this past spring, I can't help but come to the conclusion that students are, have gone through some significant trauma. They suddenly found themselves being sort of, pulled away from their schools, places that they had grown to love, to care about, to feel safe in, to connect with caring adults, to engage in activities, whether those were, academic pursuits or choir or music programs or art programs or sports programs and what have you. And suddenly their lives were disrupted. They found themselves at home. They found themselves maybe with mom and dad also at home to juggle all the different responsibilities. Found themselves suddenly having to learn remotely and the challenges that presents. And so, it drove home what trauma may look like and how trauma can arise in even the very shortest moments in every single household across the state. Fortunately for Ohio, a couple of years ago, we passed and adopted a strategic plan for education. And one of the key components of that strategic plan was a focus on social emotional learning. And that focus was actually articulated as part of the 4 key learning domains for students. So it was the first time in Ohio's history that we actually called out social and emotional learning as its own component and its own very deliberate component of the education experience for students. And that phenomenon not only was met, first of all, it reflected what was already happening in our classrooms. I'm always careful to say that it wasn't the SEA that all of a sudden came up with this brilliant idea. We heard from it. We heard from teachers, we heard from parents, we heard from educators all over the state that this was something of significance and of importance and was vital to the successful academic achievement of our students. And so we incorporated it in the strategic plan, and that caused almost a shift in the entire culture of the education community, where suddenly people felt empowered to talk about social emotional learning, to think about it, to communicate about it, and so forth and so on. Part of that plan called on us at the department to enact social emotional learning standards, which we did shortly thereafter, which supported creating a common language that not only served the education community, but also served our local boards of mental health. We engaged in deeper partnerships with our Department of Mental Health. When the Governor Mike DeWine was elected, he had a very strong perspective on the needs of children across the state, and he made a significant financial commitment in his first biennial budget to provide additional supports for success and wellness of students. He bought into that notion of meeting the needs of the whole child and was willing to put money on the table to support districts in doing that work, including work in the social and emotional learning space. And the fact that we had laid the groundwork with our strategic plan as well as with our standards made sure that the education community was ready to accept those dollars and make strategic investments. And that's what we've seen. But I also want to take the moment to make sure I thank our congresspersons and the federal government, because some of that I appreciated Congressman Scott referencing Project Aware, because we have used the intensity of social emotional support in our state we had a Project Aware grant from SAMHSA we did in partnership with our Department of Mental Health. We also had a school climate transformation grant from the U.S. Department of Education, and have received a number of other supports, including a statewide family engagement center grant that was empowered by the social emotional work happening in our state. And we have actually seen powerful uses of social emotional learning and strategies happening across the state in all our districts, with that keen and growing recognition that those competencies are hugely important to not only the success of our students, but their well-being. We've also leveraged our 21st Century Community Learning Centers grants to be a catalyst for continuing to promote social emotional learning and meeting those needs in our students. So CASEL has been a fantastic partner. They have been a key resource to us as we've done this work, and we've been very appreciative. And yet we also recognize that additional investments and additional work is so necessary, especially as we go into school reopening. Students are going to find themselves in many different places. They're going to find themselves with many different needs. Our education system is beginning to be equipped to do the work, but much more can be done. And we look forward to continuing to partner with our federal counterparts, with our districts and schools, our philanthropic community, our other community organizations, and getting the job done for our students. Thanks.
Thanks, Paulo. And next, we are going to hear from Oregon Deputy Director of Education, Carmen Xiomara Urbina. Carmen?
Okay. Hello, everyone. Again, just a lot of gratitude for being invited to be part of this beautiful and amazing panel. And as I start, I have to bring our director of the Oregon Department of Education, Cole Gill, that consistently challenge us every day to create. He consistently tells us we need to create what our children, our students, our families, and communities deserve, not fixing what we currently have. So consistently, he's asking, we need to innovate, we need to think differently, and we need to think outside of the box. So it is a pleasure to be able to share with all of you Oregon's journey as we have designed an integrated model of mental and emotional health and well-being through a lens of equity, racial equity, and anti-racism. Next slide. So as we start our conversation, I feel that we need to understand the time of the clock of the world that we're currently in and what is our responsibility. So in Oregon, we know that the conditions of inequity existed before the pandemic, and in the now they have been amplified. nothing new, but we are seeing them. And as leaders, we have the responsibility, and we're defining responsibility, the ability we have to do or not to do, to say or not to say, to freeze, or do something. So in Oregon, we've decided to lean in and do something. So we need to understand also that in Oregon, the context we're currently living through is complex, and it is impacted by local and immediate needs of our community, including varying community capacities, plus multiple agendas and multiple levels of knowledge, beliefs, and expertise. We also understand that all parts of our system are significantly strained due to the impact of the pandemic has had on our economy, and that communities have been impacted disproportionately. We need to lean in and have that authentic conversation so we can come up with solutions. That the high impact of racism on students and families and staff cannot be understated or ignored as we forge a path forward. And we must recognize that there's proportionate impacts and respond to counter inequities. And when we talk about centering equity in our plan, that means working to alleviate the repattern education to meet both these moments and to begin to solve the inequities and racism that have existed for generations. And also when we're focusing and centering our students, what does that look like, sound like, and feel like? Next slide. So I want to be able to introduce to you this beautiful group of students that I met a few months ago. And I want to focus on the story of Juan. And he is the young fourth grader with a white sweater. Juan, as he was waiting for his asylum papers at the border, he was in a cage for 4 months. When he arrived to his community, a coastal community in Oregon, with his family, Juan was full of scabies, level 4. So if you see his hands, they are scarred. His whole body looks like his hands. They're completely scarred because of the scratching of the scabies. Now, the trauma that he faced at such a young age, being in a cage for 4 months, not being with his loved ones or adults, you can only imagine. But what I want to highlight is that Juan came from Guatemala, speaks a beautiful indigenous languages, Quiche, and his eyes were full of hope. Through as translator, I asked him, Juan, what do you want to be when you grow up? And Juan wants to be a trilingual doctor, not only speaking Quiche, but speaking Spanish and speaking English. So when we focus on the assets and the love of our students, he came to that loving community to join his family. When I think about our North Star, Juan and Maria, and Jose and Ricardo are our North Star. So I want to bring us to center our students and our beautiful students and look at their beautiful faces and their stories. And so when we're working when we focus on our students and what our students can do, we need to focus on working more from students' abilities by building on their strengths that students can bring and their communities can bring. An asset orientation that seeks to create lifelong learners who are confident in their abilities to master new skills and create culturally responsive schools are about healthy relationship and self-esteem and high expectations for academic, social, and emotional growth. So when I'm thinking about our North Star, when we're thinking about centering, I think about Juan every single time we're making a decision. And how do we center and create the conditions, which is our responsibility, to make Juan become a doctor, a trilingual doctor that is surrounded by his cultural identity development, as being Guatemalan, speaking Quiche, and serving. Next slide. So therefore, as we're centering our students, through the leadership of Dr. Grace Bullock, we have developed an integrated model of mental health and well-being, because we understand that as an SEA, we have to lead and we have to balance what this looks like, sounds like, and feels like in real time to be able to support our superintendents, our school districts, to be able to support our schools, to be able to support our students. And with that, we have developed a 4-pronged, beautiful approach and 4 pillars of practice, which is trauma-informed, which is create secure environments and psychological safety, SEL-driven, which is build an intra and interpersonal awareness of competencies, with its strength-based, which is cultivating resilience and trusting relationships, and equity-centered, So what does that mean when all of these things are playing at the same time, for the greater good of every single one of our students? With that, we also understand that as an SEA, we're not alone and we cannot do this alone. We need our partners. We need our community partners. We need our BIPOC community voices. And we need our public agency like the Oregon Health Authority to lean in with us to co-create, again, what Cold Guilt tells us. Let's not fix what we have. Let's create what our students, our communities, and our families deserve. Next slide. So with this, we have created, next slide, please. What is, how do we change our discourse in schools? And so for us is how do we elevate this conversation from a D1 to a D2, utilizing the integrated model of mental health and well-being, which is just a simple example. I don't want to be talking about our dropouts. I want to be talking about our pushouts, because the problem is not in our communities when we're looking internally in our system. When we're looking at our BIPOC, our Black, our Indigenous, and our people of color community, and when we're applying an equity lens, which is, the identification of the inequities, which is the identification of the inequities and the gaps that exist. Next slide, please. In our system. So let's be really clear. One of the things that I found that equity is a word that right now has been compromised. And in Oregon, we are leaning into equity is the ability that we have to be able to identify who are the children, families, and communities that we're not serving. So therefore, we are identifying the inequities that exist and the opportunities, access, teaching, learning gap, working gaps, achievement gaps that exist within our system. Racial equity is when we're applying a lens because we understand that historically, traditionally, and currently our BIPOC community has been underserved by our system. And when we're applying an anti-racist stance, that means that it's good to have the intentions, but we need to lean into doing. We need to be able to move forward and not only have the intention. And having an anti-racist lens allows us to be able to do that. Next slide. So I wanted to share with all of you kind of the journey really fast in 5 minutes that we're going through, but that for us being able to center equity, a racial equity lens and an anti-racist stance, it's not an option. It is from our governor to our director, Cold Gill, to how this is going to be manifested in real time in our communities. Also that it takes a village to raise a child. Absolutely. And I want to bring the spirit and the beautiful words of Representative John Lewis, which he beautifully said, if it's not us, who? And if it's not now, when? And he said, for Oregon, I know that it is us and it is now, that we need to take this challenge to transform, reform, and interrupt the racial inequities and lean into the greater good of every single one of our children in Oregon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. We appreciate your work and your passion. I wanted to ask a few questions to our panelists just to probe a little bit further into some of the things that you shared. We'll start with Dr. Prejean Harris, who talked about the work that's happening in Atlanta Public Schools. I would love to hear a little bit more from you about how Atlanta has been able to support having an SEL liaison and school team work in collaboration with the SEL coordinators and the SEL director at every school to ensure social and emotional learning is woven throughout the staff and students' daily experience, as opposed to only with the program, but really part of their education. Are there challenges that you're facing, and what supports are you looking for to enable that to happen?
So I think the most important aspect of our SEL work in APS has been the intentionality of our Board of Education and our superintendent to put the work at the center of everything that we do as a district. When districts take the opportunity to fund a district SEL team, they're also sending the message that this is a core value of the work that we do. One thing that has been very important in terms of the work that our team is doing is building the capacity of school leadership teams. And where we recognized early in the journey that it was important to support our adults and to make them feel needed and supported. We use a trainer model with our SEL liaisons, but most times these these people also serve in other roles. They're either counselors or administrators in the school setting. And we pour into them so that they could go back to their schools and pour into their teachers, who are then able to model these competencies for the students. Of course, idealistically, we would want every school to have their own SEL coach so that we can take that strain off of school administrators and school counselors and really have someone who is focusing on building the capacity of adults in the building. But our team does a good job, and our principals do a great job of supporting us in the work and really believing in the work of SEL. And so they allow people who have other roles to also join in doing this work with our team as a district.
Thank you. I also wanted to circle back and talk a little bit more to Superintendent DeMaria. You talked a lot about the conditions in Ohio and how the State Department has learned from districts who have been prioritizing SEL, like Cleveland and others. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how your standards work has helped in that area, and if any of those districts have seen outcomes as a result of their focus on SEL.
Yeah, I think they've served us very well. And in particular, I think back to during the school closing period, one of the things that happened was when schools found themselves suddenly with buildings closed, but still with the imperative to continue education, I asked every section of my agency to put out information documents on all the different aspects that people need to keep in mind in those circumstances. And we put out a SEL document that helped provide tips and suggested ideas for schools and their staff to stay connected with students. And I was just so heartened and encouraged when I would see, Twitter postings or Facebook postings. Teachers were doing drive-bys. They're connecting with kids by phone just to let them know that the system, that they continue to be cared for, they continue to be loved, they continue to be supported in what they did, and that the education community was rallying around meeting their needs. I think a lot of that was derivative from the fact that we had already laid the groundwork for people understanding the importance of addressing those social and emotional needs in our students, and then also helped to promote students' own learning, and in fact using the trauma of that real-time sort of school building closure to help students sort through their own feelings, their own emotions, their own realities, and to see it as a opportunity and develop those assets that will serve them so well through their lives. So I think the standards, they create a common language, and so our partners, especially the county boards of mental health and our State Department of Mental Health, are just such exceptional because we share a common goal when it comes to children and supporting their needs. And I think the standards help build that connective tissue to make us work effectively and efficiently.
Great. And since you brought up also the mental health question, there was a question from the group about how do educators distinguish between social and emotional support provided versus significant mental health concerns, especially in communicating with families. And I'll ask that of the other panelists as well. And especially when you're trying to use language that is comfortable for families or even native speakers, are there ways in which you are aware of your districts who are communicating directly with families around social emotional supports versus mental health needs?
Yeah, so I'll start a little bit. I think we embrace significantly a multi-team system of supports where we know there are some universal things that all students need, but then it's training for teachers and others to identify when students might have more individualized needs or personalized needs that reach a higher level. We, as many states, struggle with ensuring that our schools are staffed with highly qualified mental health personnel, but we've managed to help establish a number of key partnerships. I'm familiar with one district in particular that has a behavioral health provider represented even in their daily staff meetings that talk about individual student needs. And part of it's also triaging. We know that a lower level person may be able to identify needs, but then in higher level mental health practitioners and experts to tend to those needs and leverage some of the funding systems. We tried to do a better job of linking our work to Medicaid. We have a very strong partnership with our Department of Medicaid, and in fact, leverage their databases to understand how many students might be challenged by mental health issues. And again, through those partnerships, I think we ultimately are able to identify the students that have needs and deliver to the best of our ability services and engage with parents in the spirit of making sure they understand what's happening and the kinds of things that they can do to support their children.
Great, thank you so much. And Carmen, I'd love to also follow up that same question with you. I know in your state you talked about the language barriers and the multiculturalism that exists in your state. Are there, I know that you have several resource pages on your website that are geared towards families and students that have multiple languages available. Can you talk a little bit about how you are, speaking about the importance of making that a best practice and making them accessible to families in all backgrounds, and especially how you're communicating about social and emotional supports versus mental health supports that might be needed?
So one of the things that we have done in Oregon is that, all the materials that we've created specifically, under COVID in order to provide information to our communities, we also checked with our community-based organizations, culturally responsive community-based organizations, to be able to calibrate the messages that we needed to send. And I also have to be completely transparent that it is a challenge. It's an extreme challenge because we do have multiple languages, like possibly every other state, from Chinese, Russian, Somali, Spanish, Vietnamese, etc. And also we have indigenous language like Quiche, Mang, Cuancuabal, from that come from Mexico, and Guatemala. So are we trying? Absolutely, yes. Is it a challenge? Yes. And one of the things that in collaboration with our Oregon Health Authority, we're trying to be able to think outside of the box, and can we bring a mental health SEL type of promotora style programs that we are bringing from communities, specifically when we're talking about our BIPOC communities, our indigenous communities, people from the neighborhoods, from those communities, to be able to provide them with professional development training so they can go back to the community and they can be that workforce that is holding the initial space, around that tier 1 prevention and skill building. So then we can use the resources that we have and that we need to develop around that targeted intervention, which be the tier 2. So it's always a calibration, but definitely counting with our culturally based, community-based organizations to support us.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I have one more question, Rose, for you about your work in Atlanta Public Schools. Can you just elaborate just a little bit about how you're doing the Train the Trainer program? There was a question that came in where folks are interested in knowing more about that.
Yes, definitely. So in Atlanta Public Schools, our SEL supports are tier 1, and our mental health supports are tier 2 and tier 3. And so SEL is universal for us as a district. And so in our Train the Trainer program, we meet once a month with our SEL liaisons, and we provide them with all of the resources that they need to help build the adult SEL capacity. One of the other great things about our district is that SEL sits on the teaching and learning side of our programming, and we also every month get to meet with our school leadership teams and also train them around social and emotional learning supports. We have our definitions of teacher and leader excellence that is really grounded in SEL, and SEL is one of the major components of our definition of teacher and leader excellence. And then we have the opportunity to continuously train everyone, department leaders, departments, school leaders, parent liaisons. And to go back to your original question, Melissa, around how we bring this forth to our kids in the school is really about modeling those competencies. And and the kids actually bringing those pieces home. So we do a theme and a competency of the month. We have SEL books of the month, and our kids go home to speak about those things, and parents come back and they ask questions about what's going on. What is this SEL? What are these breathing techniques? What is my kid talking about? Because the kids go home and SEL their parents. And so then when they come to parent trainings, then we're able to have conversations around what SEL skills that we're teaching kids and competencies that we're teaching kids in school. And we help them to build their SEL skills and competencies. So it comes full circle.
Thank you. And I think you're speaking to the importance of a systems approach to SEL, where you have that infused into all departments. We're running out of time, so I want to just quickly wrap up. We know a lot of work needs to happen both prior to and during school opening for schools, districts, and families to all be working together in. And we know that social and emotional learning with strong relationships, mental health supports, instructional practices that all acknowledge the racial inequities need to be front and center for all of these decisions. There's a few multiple policy levers that we are hoping are really coming through in some of these conversations that we are ready to move forward with. Number one, it's clearly critically important to integrate SEL and positive youth development in those key policy efforts. And that means policies focused on school climate, school discipline reform, academic instruction, among others. And we need to also identify what are the conditions that promote SEL within the education pipeline so that we are actually hiring teachers that have had pre-service training. And then also, how do we hire them? And how do we make sure that they're effective thinking about the SEL lens? Third, we want to ensure that states and districts have access to funds to promote the professional learning. We heard a lot about the professional learning piece, which requires significant funding. We would like that funding to promote equity-focused SEL, and that will continue to include seed grants in that funding. Fourth, we know that funding is needed for evidence-based SEL programs and practices, including training and support for educators to engage families and the community partners in those practices. And then, of course, we also want to see policies that encourage the use of data for continuous improvement, along with professional learning on how to do that, especially identifying and selecting practices and social emotional competency measures for formative purposes, as well as other school climate data. And as we're looking at these policies, as well as all policies, we know it's critically important to do an equity audit to understand that the policies that promote or hinder SEL development in youth, especially for youth of color or other youth of marginalized backgrounds. So our call to action today is really to call on the public to take action now to encourage Congress to prioritize SEL investments for next year's budget. There is a URL that is available on the slide if you want to take that action. Committee for Children and CASEL will be sending subsequent action alerts for SEL investments in the next COVID-19 stimulus package. So please stay tuned for that as well. Thank you all again for joining us today and for prioritizing this information. I agree wholeheartedly with the John Lewis quote that you shared earlier, that if not us, who, and if not now, when. So I'm grateful to be a part of this group who has taken on the responsibility of being the who and also to be part of this now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa, and to all the panelists and to the congressional leaders who have joined us today and to those who have taken the time to listen in.